Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, and we apologise for the delay in our start. Some more tech gremlins in our system, but fortunately, not like last time, we're ready to go, and we've got a great webinar for you this morning. So before we begin, some housekeeping. I'm going to show you our control panels. There we go. During the webinar, you'll be able to add questions for our guests through the control panel that says questions in the little drop-down box. You can post questions at any time, and we will have time for question and answer throughout at the end of the webinar. Your mics and cameras will remain off for the session. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the ARACY website and YouTube channel. ARACY hosts webinars to share information and promote discussion across a range of topics. We welcome the opportunity to highlight the research of others and centre the voices of those with lived experience through these webinars. We seek to grow capability and knowledge across the sector. I would now like to introduce Kieran Sampson from our Knowledge Translation team, who will be hosting this webinar. Thank you, Kieran. Kieran, you appear to be on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. Good morning, and good morning to our panellists as well. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we live and work on lands whose sovereignty wasn't ever ceded, and acknowledge the deep connection Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have to country and community throughout Australia. We at ARACY pay respects to elders past, present, and those yet to be. We also support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We seek to see our children thrive. Central to the Uluru Statement are children, and through meaningful dialogue, change can be driven to build a better future. We're open to change. Responsive relationships built through dialogue and positive interactions are crucial to developing healthy brains and healthy lives. We acknowledge a history of displacement can have intergenerational effects, contributing to adverse experiences for children and families. Supporting and modelling respectful dialogue in the community will promote connection and engagement to deliver improved outcomes for children and families. We're really pleased that you could join us for the first in what we expect will be a series of lunchtime webinars to showcase the work of the Longitudinal Studies Collaborative. This webinar will give an overview of the history of the ARACY Longitudinal Studies Collaborative, explore the breadth of longitudinal studies happening around our region, and hear about one of the newfound cross-cohort collaborations, paving ways for innovative approaches to improve mental health and wellbeing for children and young people. Lots of juicy stuff. Firstly, it's my pleasure to introduce the Honorary Professor Ann Sanson. Anne was a founding director of the Australian Temperament Project and was the initial project lead for the longitudinal study of Australian children and founding convener of the Longitudinal Studies Network. We're thrilled that Anne could join us to share the origin and history of the Longitudinal Studies Collaborative and its aspirations and goals. Welcome, Anne.
Thanks very much, Kieran, and it's lovely to be here with some familiar faces and some new ones. So I'm very delighted to be able to talk about the Longitudinal Studies Collaborative and its history. So what I want to do is to take you down a bit of a trip down memory lane. Now, I can't see my slides, so I'm hoping everything is okay. Liz, at your end with clicking over the slides. So if you can go to the second slide. So really, to tell you the story of the Longitudinal Studies Network, which is how it started out, we really need to go back to the whole history of ARACY and also of the longitudinal study of Australian children. And that takes us back to the turn of the century. It's hard to believe we're nearly a quarter of the way through it already. But about that time, there was a lot of concern from a lot of people around Australia about this poor statistics, about the indicators of child and youth health, development and well-being, and the level of inequalities and all of that. And we realized, a lot of people were realizing we needed to work better across sectors and across disciplines. And I guess from my experience with the Australian Temperament Project, going back to 1983, I had personally experienced the challenges of transferring knowledge from research into policy and practice. There was also a real awareness about the need for a national longitudinal study of Australian children. And then around the turn of the century, the government announced $20 million to start the longitudinal study of Australian children. So there's a whole lot of interest in longitudinal studies, in working together better across sectors. And I was then at the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and we hosted a meeting where we called a lot of the main players in the area, across disciplines, paediatricians, epidemiologists, psychologists, educators, and so on. And we basically set ourselves two questions. Did we want to put in a bid for the longitudinal study of Australian children? And did we want to form something like a Australian Research Alliance of some sort? And we said yes to both of those questions. And Fiona Stanley took the lead in what became ARACY, and I took the lead in putting in a bid for LSAC. So that was really the start of LSAC, and you can see, I hope on the screen, one of the early logos we had for ARACY. So one thing we did early on was realizing we needed some sort of funding stream to get all this started. So we persuaded the ARC and NHMRC to start a new funding stream for research networks, which they did, and we duly applied for one and got one. So that was the ARACY, NHMRC Research Network, which was pretty big. We had 256 different network participants, 56 contributing organisations, and we did lots of great projects. I took on the role of coordinating it. We had our New Investigators Network, where we had bright young people learning about working collaboratively across disciplines and sectors. Our main activity was seed funding a whole lot of different projects, 55 different seed funding projects, many of which are now going on as successful projects. But one thing we recognised early on was that existing longitudinal studies weren't talking to each other very much, and realised that the research network could be a vehicle for addressing this. So if we can go to the next slide, thanks, Liz. So our reasons then for starting the longitudinal studies network was that these long-term studies that cover from childhood through adolescence to adulthood can yield very valuable data on developmental processes involved in multiple aspects of both healthy development as well as maladjustment. We did have a number of reasonably large-scale longitudinal studies in Australia and New Zealand, but to date, the contact between these had been very informal and spasmodic, and nearly all the studies said that they had a lot more data than they were able to analyse, so it was an untapped resource, and very few cross-study analyses had been undertaken. A couple had, but not much. And we didn't have much in the way of coordinated efforts at data collection to make sure we were measuring the same things in the same sort of ways. But talking to these studies, there was clearly quite a lot of enthusiasm for there to be stronger linkages. If you go to the next slide, it seemed like now was really the right time. That was then the right time to be thinking about starting a research network. Because I think there was increasing awareness at that time of the value of longitudinal data for addressing some of these complex issues with lots of policy and practice relevance that we were concerned about. It was also a time when there was growing awareness and interest in genetic determinants of health and psychosocial development, something that of course has gone on hugely since that time. But it was just starting then, and that meant we needed large sample sizes and or replication across studies. And then, because many of these studies, the participants were reaching adulthood, there were exciting possibilities for looking at a wide range of intergenerational issues through coordinated study of the second generations of these cohorts. And there was increasing interest in data linkage with some technical advances that made it a bit easier. So it seemed very timely. So if we go to the next slide, we held a 2-day workshop in August 2006, and looking back at those notes, I can see it was a very productive workshop. It was run by the Research Network in partnership with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And our aims were, as this slide says, to recognise and celebrate the longitudinal studies that we did have, to start an audit of what sort of data we did have and how much commonality there was across studies, to look at the value of these studies in the new millennium, as it then was, and to look at collaborative opportunities, key questions, key hurdles and barriers and solutions, what sort of tools and processes we had available for collaboration, and identifying the needs for resources and capacity building in doing any sort of collaborative research, and to decide what our next steps should be. So if we go to the next slide, this lists, well, we invited researchers from studies which had been going for quite some time, had data from early in life, had multiple follow-ups, had reasonably large sample sizes, had participants who were at or near reproductive age and who were really interested in understanding developmental pathways from the biological through to the socio-ecological. So the studies that were invited are listed on this slide, and all of these, except for the Dunedin study, were able to send representatives. And then we also invited people who had expertise in data linkage, in research funding, a really important thing, in genetic and epigenetic research, and then we also had as observers some people from smaller or more newly emerging studies. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go really quickly through this, so I suspect I'm running out of time. But there are a number of themes arose from the workshop. The first was looking at how studies had responded to different age-appropriate themes as they got older, and how the theoretical orientations that were adopted also changed as the studies matured. A second theme that came out was how we all had experienced the frustration of getting our data to make a difference, to have the uptake of research evidence in policy and practice, and the feeling that working together we might have a stronger voice. All the many reasons for collaboration, sharing expertise across studies, pooling intellectual resources, increasing the productivity of individual studies, the pooling data and replications being really valuable, avoiding unnecessary replication, and so on and so forth. If we go to the next slide, another theme was the sorts of collaborations that had happened and the varying success they had, and we noted how collaboration was used in a lot of different ways. We also identified the obstacles to collaboration, which included a lack of common focus. I hope you've gone to the next slide, Liz. I can't see what you're on. The lack of a common focus or shared interest, difficulties in resolving IP issues, an academic culture that promotes rivalry rather than cooperation, the differences of different languages and cultures in different disciplines, and so on. And then we also, if we go to the next slide, looked at the things that led to successful collaborations. And we'll see many of these things at work as you hear more from Craig about what's been happening since this time. So a clear mutual benefit to all parties, creating something bigger than anything we could do on our own. Having strong leaders and advocates was really important. Having good relationships, having some sort of, even though different studies have got different foci, having some sort of overarching a shared meta theory about human development. communication, easily available information like a website, and you'll see the progress that's been made in that area, having some funding, having clear agreements, and a willingness to share. So if we go to the next slide, I think I'll go really fast through these. We looked at one form of collaboration being just cooperation, sharing our knowledge about how to handle missing data, sharing measures, sharing expertise. So there are good examples of that happening, and a wish to be able to maximize doing that. And then looking at coordination and collaboration on the next slide, the importance of having at least some common measures across studies, the exciting possibilities for second generation research, the importance of replications and joint analyses, really important, and it's important to have easier access to study documentation in order to be able to do those. Pooled data, and then also from the advocacy area, the possibility that working together we could develop statements on policy relevant issues based on our research, and advocate not only for improvements in support for children's and adolescents' healthy development, but also for adequate funding and support for longitudinal research. So everybody who attended that workshop, if you go to my last slide now, Liz, everybody who attended the workshop wanted to join, which was terrific, and a few others have joined since then. And over the next 5 years, we conducted all sorts of capacity building activities like workshops and think tanks, access grid seminars. I wonder if many of you remember those. They were sort of precursor to these webinars and Zooms, where we would all gather in different locations around Australia and see each other on big screens, so we could network locally at the same time as communicate across the nation. They were pretty clunky things. We also had symposia at ARACY conferences, and a number of collaborations did develop, like the cannabis cohort research collaboration that Delyse was very important, which wasn't directly a part of the research network, but it reflected that wish to be working together. And then in 2011, Craig and Delyse took over the convenership of the Longitudinal Studies Network, and you're going to hear about the wonderful things that they have been doing since then. So that's the end of my bit. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you for having the foresight and fortitude to develop such a collaboration. I'm sure hundreds of researchers have benefited from it, and probably millions of children, so thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Craig and Delyse, as Anne mentioned. They are the conveners of the ARACY Longitudinal Studies Collaborative currently, and they're joining us to talk about how together they have continued the legacy of Anne's work in advocating for the value of life course studies, and in particular, the value of bringing them together. Craig holds an NHMRC Fellowship in Life Course Epidemiology and is the current Director of the Australian Temperament Project. Delyse also holds an NHMRC Fellowship in Clinical Developmental Psychology and is currently Director of the BBB Pregnancy Cohort Study. Craig and Delyse, I'll now hand over to you both to share the work you've done with the collaborative since 2011, and I believe you'll also briefly showcase the relaunched Australasian Longitudinal Studies Directory website. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Anne, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking us through that incredible history of thinking around cohort studies and the values of building those connections that now so deeply enrich us. So on Anne's retirement in 2011, which was really just a sideways step, Anne, wasn't it, into this wonderful world of climate change work that you're now leading here and around the world. Delyse and I took up the baton of responsibility for the network, and we started to bring together some of the ideas that Anne's presented on there. And the first of these was to develop a single point of truth web directory where we could sort of bring together all the child, adolescent and young adult cohort-based work happening across Australia and New Zealand. Now I'm just wanting to share some slides, Liz, but nothing's coming up here. And that directory was really developed from the beginning to with 3 goals in mind. Firstly, to celebrate the remarkable achievements of each study. Here it comes. Just open this up for you guys now. Hopefully you can see that. So the first goal was really to celebrate the remarkable achievements of each study. Each study is an enormous volume of work and now exceedingly long-term body of work too, with some of our cohorts now, as Anne's saying, crossing into 2nd and 3rd generations of participant follow-up. The second goal was to really ensure that groups knew about each other and could reach out to connect with each other and to form new collaborations and do new types of work. And that's that real synergistic catalysing connections component that Anne mentioned. And the other role was simply to advocate for the importance of these incredibly rare studies, which we all see as nothing short of national treasures. So about 10 years ago, thereabouts, we worked with the graphics and web design group at the Melbourne Royal Children's Hospital, and we put together the very first version of our web directory, which Delyse will demonstrate in some detail shortly. It was designed from the beginning to be a simple online directory that started with a geographic map of where cohorts are located around Australia and New Zealand, which then can be clicked into for further details. And as you can imagine, the development of this platform took a lot of work and time to put together, and also takes a lot of work and time to maintain. And we'd very much like to thank everyone involved in getting on board when we got started and getting this information into the one place. It's terrific. So
Sorry, Craig, we just can't see your screen at the moment.
Can you see it now? Yeah, all good. Okay, we'll go through this in more detail in a minute, but this is the basic structure of this web directory that I was just talking about. Okay, so in addition, and building on the idea that workforce development was also key to realising the full value of these data resources, we committed to running week-long, in-depth Lifecourse masterclasses, and we sought to get the very best people from all around the world out to Australia to lead these. The first was held in 2011 and focused on the principles and methods of cross-cohort analysis, and that was led by Professor John Horwood from the Christchurch Health and Development Study. We then held a masterclass on the principles and methods of epidemiology in 2013, which was led by Professor Ken Rothman from the Boston University School of Public Health. And in 2015, we explored the possibility of embedding in-depth observational studies into cohort studies in a masterclass led by Professor Bob Marvin from the Ainsworth Child Parent Attachment Clinic in the US. And the last one was held in 2018, which focused on emulating trials within observational data, and that was led by Professor Jonathan Stern from the University of Bristol. And then COVID hit, and we haven't had one since. But we plan to, because each was a real treat, not only in knowledge gain, but also in connecting people and teams that sit around these extraordinary studies. And we'd very much like to thank ARACY here too for their highly valued support in running these. I just wanted to change gears just for one moment and just to pause and reflect on some very significant losses that have occurred within the Lifecourse community over the past few years. We've lost a number of our leading lights, extraordinary people, each of them, who I know many of us were very close to, and have literally shaped the field of Lifecourse epidemiology for us all. And I acknowledge in particular the deaths of Professor David Ferguson in 2018. So David headed up the Christchurch Health and Development Study. From the beginning was an enormous force for good in the field of developmental sciences. Professor Margot Pryor across the COVID pandemic in 2020, who was the founding investigator with Anne and Frank Oakblad on the Australian Temperament Project. Professor George Patton, who's a very close colleague of mine last year, who established the Victorian Adolescent Health Cohort Study and its intergenerational offspin study. And also just recently, Richie Poulton, who for many years has headed up the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study in New Zealand. So these are very significant people, and our thoughts will continue to be with each of them and their families, and we'll continue to acknowledge and honour the strong foundations they've set for us to take forward. So in the spirit of going forward, what are our plans? Well, Well, we plan to continue our masterclasses series next year with details to be advised. We're also planning to host these quarterly Lifecourse webinars, which the first of which we're launching today, to provide a place for showcasing examples of leading cohorts, cross-cohort research. The focus will be on cross-cohort research across Australia and New Zealand, and we look forward to hearing from Meredith O'Connor shortly on one of these leading examples. We'll also be looking for groups to contribute highlights from the cohorts to the Did You Know section of the ARACY newsletter. I think this is a really key point of knowledge translation that we can all collectively get together and get behind. And we'll continue to update and strengthen our ARACY web directory, which I will hand over to Delyse now for an interactive guided tour. Delyse, thank you. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And Delyse, over to you.
Unmute, there we go, and hopefully share my screen. Can people see that? Is it a yes or a no, Liz? Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Great. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Anne and Craig, for talking us through the history of what was the Longitudinal Studies now network and is now the Longitudinal Studies Collaborative. It's certainly been a really productive history and one that I've very much enjoyed being involved in over the years. So today, as Craig said, I'm going to showcase the ARACY website, and really I'll just give a brief overview because people can explore the website in their own time, but just to give a bit of a tour, if you like. So firstly, just to find the website, there's a couple of ways to access it. On the ARACY webpage, if you click on the Nest in Action and then in ARACY, that will take you to a page where you can scroll down and just click directly into the website. Alternatively, it's fairly easy to locate with a Google search or other web search if you type in ARACY Lifecourse, or you can put lifecourse.org.au directly into the hyperlink on your web browser. This will bring you up to the homepage of the website, which is an interactive map, as Craig mentioned. And this really is designed to show where many of our studies are situated across the region in Australia and New Zealand. And it is interactive, so in particular, if you're interested, for example, in finding out about a study that was based in Brisbane, you could click onto that dot point, and it'll take you to what the studies are, where they're located in terms of their administering institutions. And so, for example, here, if I click onto this one, I see that brings up the Mater University pregnancy study, and I can then click on more to find out more information about that study. The alternate way to access information on the individual cohorts is to click on the cohort button along the top. And here this lists all of our cohorts included currently in alphabetical order. So you can scroll through those to find studies of interest. If, however, you'd like to more directly search, you can do so by state. So, for example, if I was interested in locating studies that are listed in New South Wales, I'd just click on the button there and so forth. Or you can search by the name of a study. So, for example, the study that I'm involved in is the BBB study. So if I pop that in, it'll bring up the study that I'm interested in finding information on.
Sorry, Delyse, I think you might have just moved something in front of your microphone. We're having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me
now? Have you moved something near your keyboard? Yes, that's it.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so in terms of actually finding out information on individual studies that are listed within the website, I'm going to talk through an example, again, a study that I'm involved in, which is the BBB pregnancy cohort study. And if we click into that, this provides an overview, a high-level overview about this study. So you can find out information on the purpose of the study with a brief synopsis, those who are involved, including principal investigators, as well as project managers, and contact information. And so if you're interested in perhaps finding out about how you might be able to access data or whether there's opportunities for collaboration, this is a great way to do that. There's also information on the collaborating institutions and some high-level information on the funding for that particular study. And really useful, I think, is connections to the websites for studies if they have one, and any kind of cohort profile paper or study overview paper that might be have more information on the study. And this feature I think is really useful, just reflecting back to Anne and Craig's discussions. When I first started working in longitudinal research, it was really hard to find information on studies that were currently operating in our region, and it was either kind of by word of mouth or through the research that you were reading about, or alternatively by kind of sporadic web searches that brought up a mix of information. So having this all co-located here makes it really easy to contact studies and find out about what's actually happening in the field. There's also some high-level information about when the study commenced, the number of participants, and the kinds of data that have been collected in a given study. So here, for example, we have NAPLAN and some biosamples, in addition to more common kinds of measures around substance use and mental health through surveys and interviews. Down the bottom of the page for each of the independent cohorts, there's a little bit more detail on the waves within each study and their focus, or the age of participants, and how many participants were involved across each of those waves. And we can add to this. So for example, our most recent wave was in middle childhood, but we're about to start an adolescent wave. And once we commence that, we can add that as a new wave and keep adding as studies grow over time. So that's an example of how to get to an independent cohort. We also have a growing number of consortia being listed on the website. And this is something we're really excited about, because this goes back to, again, Anne and Craig were touching on, is really a desire to work together more to address questions that we may not be able to address adequately within independent studies. And there's a growing number, as I said, and we're going to hear from Meredith in a moment about the work that she's involved in. But I'll click on an example. Again, it's a study that I've worked on, so one that I'm familiar in talking about. This is an example of a consortium, the Cannabis Cohort Research Consortium, which was set up at the time when legislation around the world was starting to change in terms of legalisation of cannabis use. And so this was set up to really try and understand through cross-cohort research the impacts of cannabis use on development in adolescents and young people. And it brought together a range of investigators across a number of different studies, which I'll showcase in a moment. So this, again, follows a very similar structure to the independent cohorts, but higher level again in terms of multiple studies being involved in a given consortia. So similar information about funding and any information about where you can find out more about the study in terms of website information, cohort profiles, or study contacts, and a list of the studies involved in this particular collaboration at the bottom of the page. So as I said, we're seeing a growing number of consortiums, and we're really excited to see that increase and to showcase those as part of our webinar series in the coming year. And also we are finding lots of new cohorts as we've refreshed this website, which we're really excited to include. And if any of you out there think, oh, my cohort might be suitable to list, we'd really welcome you to reach out to Craig and I and get in touch. We'll definitely welcome new cohorts to join the directory, and any new cohorts that might be being set up as well. Please don't hesitate to get in touch, because we'd very much like to make the directory as comprehensive as possible. And finally, I'd just really like to thank again everyone who's been involved over the years, both in the network and collaboration, but also in setting up this directory. It has, as Craig mentioned, been a lot of work and a lot of people involved, and we're just really proud to showcase this, and it's hopefully going to be really valuable for people to find information about the studies that are operating in our region and to promote greater connection between studies. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Meredith.
Thanks, Craig and Delyse. Well, certainly we at ARACY are really pleased to be able to provide ongoing support for the collaborative and help connect people to your work and the research outcomes. It's really central to the work that we do. Our final presenter for today's webinar is Meredith O'Connor. Meredith is the Senior Research Fellow, Program Lead of the Melbourne Children's Lifecourse Initiative and Scientific Advisor for the Longitudinal Study of Australian Children since 2018. She's a strong advocate for cross-cohort research to maximise the value of existing cohort data by allowing us to address questions that we can't address with individual cohort studies, as Delyse mentioned. Meredith, thank you for joining us to share a little bit about the work you've done across cohorts to further understand mental health in our changing world. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Kieran, for that lovely introduction. I'm hoping that you can see my screens. Is that all looking good? And I can't see you, so I'll take silence as no news is good news. So thank you so much, Kieran, and to Delyse and Craig and Anne for having me along today. And first up, just want to offer my congratulations to the ARACY team on the relaunch of the Longitudinal Studies Network. We can see the rich history that this builds on, that Anne has walked us through. Fascinating to see that backstory, and it's such a wonderful chance to come together at a national scale. What I want to add to the mix now is to share an example of how our longitudinal studies can play such an important role in informing policy development, and particularly to explore how our cohorts can come together in ways that make them larger than the sum of its parts, how we can join forces across cohorts enabled by these kinds of collaborative platforms to achieve even more, and to really use what I can't agree more with Craig's description of these as national treasures. How can we use them to our fullest potential? The example that I'm going to explore and share with you is around how we responded within the MCRI's Lifecourse platform when COVID hit and we had very significant concerns about the mental health ramifications for children and young people. I do think it's very fitting that Lifecourse pivoted in such a strong way towards exploring COVID issues, because just before COVID hit, we adopted a new logo, and you might notice that it looks uncannily like a COVID bug. So very fitting that it became such a strong focus for us, and perhaps a bit of prescience in the Lifecourse team there. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we operate on. Lifecourse is based at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, which the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation are the traditional custodians of, and pay respects to traditional custodians across many, many different lands that I'm sure we're joining from today from right across Australia. This year, we celebrated our 10th birthday in the Lifecourse platform, and a huge number of individuals have been involved in building up the platform over that time. That includes Craig Olsson as one of our founding investigators, and it's been really wonderful to have Craig involved in both MCRI's Lifecourse initiative and the ARACY Longitudinal Studies Network, so that we have that link between the two. First of all, I want to start by going back to basics in a way and considering what is that value proposition that Lifecourse studies represent. So when we're thinking about mental health, we're not talking about a snapshot in time. Mental health unfolds as a lifelong journey and can change and develop in response to different experiences and exposures and challenges over the lifespan. And that's what makes our longitudinal studies so essential, is because they allow us to capture this development of mental health and well-being as children grow and change over years and sometimes even decades that these studies have followed children for. Australia is a major player on the global stage when it comes to longitudinal studies, and particularly those with a mental health focus. This figure is from a review that was published this year, and it looked at internationally where the greatest numbers of mental health focused longitudinal cohorts resided. The US came out as having the largest number of such cohorts, but Australia and the UK came in a very close second. So really reinforces that we are a major hub in Australia for these types of longitudinal studies. And in Australia, Murdoch Children's Research Institute down in Victoria happens to be home to a very large number of these Australian longitudinal studies. Our Lifecourse initiative brings together over 20 world-class longitudinal cohorts, and our goal is to allow researchers, both internal and external to MCRI, to be able to leverage these incredibly valuable data and undertake impactful research that ultimately benefits health and development over the life course. One of the key ways that we do this is by making these data findable to researchers who can come and explore our catalogue of what data has been captured when across these studies, and also making these studies accessible by offering a common streamlined data access pathway. So in our goals, we're highly aligned with the ARACY Longitudinal Studies Network. We all want to see these valuable data assets used to their absolute fullest potential. And indeed, these really are precious data gems. They represent huge investments from funders who come back again and again to support us to keep going out into the field, which is very costly. The cohort teams who manage these studies work incredibly hard to build up high quality data assets. And last but not least, participants themselves make a really profound contribution to these studies, coming back again and again to offer sensitive, very personal health and other data, and doing so with very little direct benefit to themselves, but rather for the good of public health. So a really incredible contribution that these participants make. One of the ways that we can maximise the value of these very precious data resources is to join forces across these studies. And in doing so, in bringing these cohorts together, we can achieve insights that are larger than the sum of their parts and beyond what we could learn from any one existing cohort. And next, I'm going to give you an example of how we've been able to join forces across cohorts in this way. So I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone what was happening in the last days of February 2020. And I know for myself as a psychologist, even in those earliest days of COVID, immediately red flags were going up for me about the mental health ramifications for children and young people. Really seemed the perfect storm for exacerbating what was already recognised as a very significant challenge facing child and adolescent health. We're introducing a very disruptive, large-scale new stressor, and we're reducing access to usual supports and structures that would promote good mental health. So really a perfect storm brewing. And we knew that our cohorts would offer something unique in being able to understand these mental health ramifications of the pandemic. And that's an understanding of how the long and winding roads that children and young people travelled before COVID came into play influenced their pandemic experiences. Because for many children, this wouldn't be the first adversity that they've encountered along that road, and nor would all children and families be entering the pandemic having accumulated the same assets and resources. So being able to have that perspective, able to look back before the COVID pandemic began, would be really critical to understanding that range of experiences through the pandemic period itself. So we brought our cohorts together very rapidly to facilitate our cohorts to get out into the field and collect that essential data about how children and young people were faring. And the role of Lifecourse was to facilitate that sharing of knowledge and approaches and that collective problem solving that was underway, because our cohorts were figuring out how to get out into the field to assess what was a whole new range of experiences, and to do so in a way that was faster than ever before, I think, in terms of going from survey design to active data collection. Of course, being based at the Royal Children's Hospital, no actual hand touching involved. We were under the strictest of COVID protocols and were learning how to navigate Zoom and Teams at the same time. This collective effort has resulted in a hugely valuable data resource. We now have data for over 9,000 children and young people across 11 different cohorts on the mental health and other indirect impacts of COVID-19. And that's a phenomenally powerful data resource, particularly because that facilitating of sharing through the Lifecourse initiative means that many of these cohorts contained aligned or harmonised data on those impacts. And that's given us an opportunity to draw these cohorts together and to use them as jigsaw puzzles that together create a larger picture. And I just want to give you one very small example of the type of work that we've been able to do and to the types of insights that we've been able to gain. So one of our first pieces of work was very simply to look at the prevalence of mental health and other indirect impacts of COVID across different domains. So high levels of COVID worries, high levels of negative mood states, worries, fears, anxieties, adverse economic impacts for families, and also positives, because we know that COVID was such a mixed bag of experiences. We were able to look at the frequency of these different domains across 7 different Lifecourse cohorts. And what's interesting about these cohorts is that they range from, on one hand, our vitality cohort being highly advantaged, initially an allergy-focused cohort that happened to recruit families with very high levels of socioeconomic advantage, right through to, on the other end of that scale, the right at home cohort, which is a targeted cohort of families facing high levels of social disadvantage. And along the way there, we have this increasing level of disadvantage across those cohorts. So when we draw them together, we're able to get a much more complete picture across the socioeconomic spectrum than any one of these cohorts would provide. When we plotted that prevalence of these different indirect impacts of COVID across each of these cohorts, what we found is that, for example, in relation to COVID worries, you can see that the prevalence of children having very high levels of COVID worries was much lower in vitality, our most advantaged cohort, as compared to right at home, our most disadvantaged cohort. And you can see that gradual stepwise kind of increase in prevalence as the level of disadvantage of the cohort goes up. Similar patterns for high levels of negative mood state and adverse economic impacts, and with a little bit more variability, the opposite direction for positives reported by the families. So this is just one example of how, by drawing cohorts together, joining forces across cohorts, we're able to reveal quite concerning socioeconomic inequalities beyond what would have been beyond the insights that would have been gained from any one of these cohorts, which individually capture a smaller segment of that socioeconomic spectrum. This is just one of many different findings that have emerged from this Lifecourse data resource and that continue to emerge. And we've summarised some of the policy considerations from these findings in a research brief that we might share in the chat. One of the clear signals in that data is that for many children and young people who are struggling during the COVID pandemic with their mental health, this represents an exacerbation of mental health challenges that predate the pandemic period. So it's really important that we take into account and understand children and young people's long-term experiences of mental health and ensure that those with very long-term problems are getting the support that they need. On a positive note, these findings also strongly reinforce what we'd known for a long time, which is that there are many opportunities to promote good mental health and to prevent mental health problems from arising by strengthening the environments that children and young people develop in across families, schools, and communities, for example. When we're thinking about these kinds of opportunities to support or prevent mental health concerns, it's critical that we make equity a central concern. We've seen that very clear evidence of an unequal distribution of mental health challenges across that socioeconomic spectrum. And as we think about or undertake research to understand the long-term implications of COVID, which is likely to have a very lasting impact on the mental health of children and young people, it's essential that we continue those longitudinal data collections, and particularly within those pre-existing cohorts that give us that potential to both look backwards and to look forwards to understand those long-term pathways. And just as I finish up now, I want to reflect on opportunities going forward, because of course, COVID is not the end of the story when it comes to these types of complex global disruptions that COVID represented. The World Economic Forum's report this year released its 10-year outlook and really emphasises that global disruptions like COVID are anticipated to become more frequent in the years ahead, including in response to a changed climate. Our COVID work provides a proof of concept in a way, or a model that we can consider for how we maximise that capacity of our longitudinal cohorts to inform strategies for promoting population health and preventing adverse outcomes during such uncertain times, and in particular, how we can join forces across cohorts to ensure that our cohorts are being used to their fullest potential. Platforms like Lifecourse and like the ARACY Longitudinal Studies Network are really critical enablers of that kind of collaborative work. So thank you so much. It's really lovely to be able to share this work with you, and I'll hand back to Kieran.
Thank you, Meredith. That was really interesting. It's certainly, we're seeing it played out in many places for children. Looking at results for Australian children around education at the moment and school refusal and things like that. So I'm certainly seeing it there. We've only got a couple of minutes left for the webinar. So we did have some questions that we were going to pose to the panel. I think I might start with sort of an overarching question, which is there any, what have we learnt from the cohort studies? What are some of the outstanding things that have come out of the work and the collaboration that you think you're most pleased about?
I'm happy to jump in and say a few words if that Delyse and Anne and Meredith can add as well. Look, I think perhaps, and Meredith, I'll get you to comment on this from your recent trip away, but it's more, I think, a case of the studies over the decades contributing bits of information that kind of develop up into a bigger flow of information that eventually shape the way children and young people develop. And I think this is the big bit. We do look for those spectacular single pieces of work, and they do exist, but the actual force and value of the studies actually sits at the level of the individual, of the productivity that happens within them and across them, that shapes the narrative, that has been shaping the narrative of how we invest in children and young people, how we raise children and young people well from the 80s and earlier if we go across to the New Zealand cohort studies. Meredith, I might just throw to you on that one, because I think this is something we were talking about the other day, wasn't it? How we sort of describe the impact of such a body of work over time.
Yeah, I think our cohort studies undeniably have made a huge contribution to our understanding and our knowledge base around health and development over the lifespan. I think for some of our cohorts, we see, or some of the many analyses and research that have been undertaken in those cohorts, we see really direct implications, like, for example, a change in clinical guidelines. From our allergy cohorts in Lifecourse, we've seen changes to infant feeding practice guidelines, for example, in Australia. But on the other side of this spectrum, we also see some very indirect but no less critical forms of impact that our cohorts provide. Our cohorts have contributed to this hugely important knowledge base of understanding about life course development, and some of the ideas that we really take for granted now and that kind of sit in the background of, you hope, or policy development, like the importance of the early years, are really understandings that have developed from our longitudinal cohort studies. So that's also a critically important part of the impact that our cohorts provide, and we can see that in cases like the Australian Temperament Project that goes back so many decades, and that knowledge base that's developed from there.
Thanks, Meredith. Well, we're right on time now, so unfortunately we probably can't go through any of the other questions. So thank you all so much for your time today. And thank you for sharing the historical development of the collaborative and ideas about how we can all connect further in the future using the directory on the ARACY website. For everyone watching, this was the first in a series of webinars that will showcase findings from the cross-cohort initiatives that bring together longitudinal studies from across Australia and New Zealand to address questions that can't be answered in individual studies alone. The next Longitudinal Studies Collaborative webinar will take place in autumn 2024 and is titled Monitoring Illicit Substance Abuse, Monitoring Illicit Substance Use, Misuse Consortium, a collaborative initiative for investigating low prevalence substance use behaviours in population cohort studies, and it will be presented by Christopher Greenwood. We look forward to having you join us again for our webinars across the year. Please, if you do have questions for the panel, hop onto the ARACY website and you'll be able to see contact details there, or contact us at ARACY and we're happy to connect you up. The recording of today's session will be available in the coming days on the ARACY website and YouTube channel, with links shared in our e-bulletin or newsletter. And if you aren't already, please subscribe to the newsletter. The details are on the screen at the moment. And thank you again to everyone. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. It's amazing work. I'm a total fangirl, have been since I was a child, working out all the things that happened in my life and how important it was for when I was a grown up. And it's fascinating and, totally necessary for us to change and improve the lives of Australia's children. So thank you. We'll bring this event to a close and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you.